Picture this. $1,000,000 grand mansions with grand columns surrounding massive front doors, foyers that could make even the royal family turn their heads, crystal chandeliers, stone fountains, balconies, and a fully staffed kitchen at the ready. But it's not the home of your favorite actress or professional athlete. Actually, it's a bunch of college kids. Sound bizarre? Well, to be perfectly honest, I think it's beyond bizarre, but that's the reality of some chapters of Greek life organizations on U.S. campuses. From the outside looking in, it's the pinnacle of a glamorous, independent experience, living out every other student's dream with your new lifelong friends right by your side. But what actually happens in these houses behind closed doors? Hello, I'm Anna, your host, and welcome to the Crime Bistro podcast, episode 32. If this is your first episode, I'm so happy to have you here, and if not, welcome back and thank you for the support. The Crime Bistro podcast is a storytelling experience for the true crime enthusiast, and today I am going to share several stories about Greek life, hazing, and the dark side of these organizations. With that time of the year approaching, this is only my second time not heading back into a classroom for the fall, so I really felt like this was a good time to introduce this conversation into the Crime Bistro community, however small it might be. We all need to be a little bit more aware. That being said, today I am sipping on a Dutch Bros coffee for the very first time, actually. And let me tell you, as a New Englander, at heart, it's not Dunkin'. But as someone who used to work at Dunkin', it's not Dunkin'. If you like coffee the way that I do, that will make sense to you. But either way, I think it's time to get on into this episode, so go ahead and grab your own coffee, caffeinated beverage, or emotional support water bottle, and let's go ahead and talk about the dark side of Greek life. Greek life is one of those things that's become almost synonymous with American culture, especially in the past few years, now that more people have been sharing their rush journeys on social media. Movies and TV shows have glamorized the lifestyle of a college sorority girl, and the aesthetic of being in Greek life is envied by high school students across the country. But Greek life is a massive organization that spans over 650 schools, with their own leadership, rules, and more than anything else, secrets. As with anything, there is a serious dark side to being in a sorority or fraternity, yet for some reason, they continue to be the most sought after and exclusive clubs to join. But why? This episode is going to be a little bit different than normal, so buckle up. I'm going to start by giving a brief background and introduction to Greek life and what it really means to be a part of it, and then we're going to tell some true stories of those who have had negative experiences, even deadly ones, with a fraternity or sorority. With back to school coming up and so many young people looking forward to starting college, moving away from home, achieving some level of independence, and really just feeling like an adult for the first time, I want this episode to be a cautionary tale. Obviously, everybody's experience is different, and every school is going to be vastly different, but students and parents should be entering these organizations with both eyes wide open, because if you don't, the consequences can genuinely be life-altering or even life-ending. So where did Greek life actually come from? We should have some context before we dive into the stories that I'll be sharing today. In the mid to late 1800s, college students started forming their own groups to discuss various topics. At the time, it was mostly literature and current events. This was, though, the start of a major cultural shift in the U.S., where students were really starting to freely express themselves and their own opinions. As the members of these groups spent more time together and became friends, they would make time for non-intellectual activities, such as parties, sports, dances, and more. It wasn't until the 1890s that these groups started to live together in chapter houses, and it was at this point where alumni networks started to become heavily involved, as groups of college students even then really just didn't have the resources to rent or buy their own homes. But if enough alumni had become successful, the alumni would then donate money to help secure a chapter house for a fraternity. This meant that the social aspect of being in a fraternity was greatly augmented by the fact that there were houses, but it also meant that there was now a lot of money involved. Alumni had to form boards to handle payments and legal matters, and active members would need to handle the day-to-day within the chapter houses. Now that the organizations had really started to expand, membership needed to become more selective, which is where we get the period of time which is now known as rush. Rush comes from the period when fraternities were literally rushing to get the potential freshman recruits on campus before any of the other fraternities approached them. When fraternities were founded, many of their so-called initiation rites or rituals were taken from ancient tradition and most notably from ancient Greek and Roman literature, hence Greek life. The consequence of this for today's members is that the classics don't have as much of a part in school curriculums, so the meanings of these ceremonies has largely been lost to time over the past couple hundred years. Many people believe that what we now refer to as hazing actually started as a misunderstanding of the ceremonies and rituals that the original fraternities had implemented. And I know up to this point we've mainly talked about fraternities, but I also want to mention the first group to call themselves a sorority was Gamma Phi Beta at Syracuse University in 1882. A common misconception about sororities and fraternities is that the schools themselves have governing power over the student groups, but this is largely untrue. Today, individual chapters are largely self-governed by active members and by alumni members, as alumni members are usually taking care of the financial aspects of the houses. For sororities, the governing body is called the Panhellenic Council, and for fraternities, the governing body is called the Interfraternity Council. At a national level, the governing body of all these organizations is known as the National Panhellenic Council. Today, Greek life appeals to students because it offers opportunities to get involved, to build your resume, to make friends, and to join a huge network of successful alumni. Many schools boast that their fraternities and sororities maintain high academic standards, foster lifelong relationships between members, and make valuable contributions to philanthropic causes, but this isn't always the case. The intense need to belong, to join these exclusive groups can have immense consequences on the mental health of members, on their physical health, and on their economic health as well. There are many costs to becoming a part of Greek life, and the stories that I'm going to share here demonstrate how vicious these organizations can actually be behind closed doors. Unfortunately, there are many instances of hazing deaths that I could reference in this episode, but most of them do contain pretty similar rhetoric. A young college student who loses their life because their fellow active members were too scared of the consequences to call for help in a dire situation. With that being said, let's talk about the tragic loss of Gordy Bailey. Now, if you're interested in true crime, this is probably a name that you've heard before, but for anyone who isn't familiar, this is such an important story to be aware of, especially if you're heading into college for the first time. Lynn Gordon Bailey Jr. was born on February 22nd of 1986 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Since his passing, his loved ones have described him as intelligent, compassionate, funny, and someone with really great leadership qualities. In high school, he attended Deerfield Academy, which is a private school where he was a standout athlete and actor. He was a starting member of the school's New England Championship lacrosse team, and he was on the football team as well. When he graduated, he actually received the Class of 2004 award in drama for his performance in the Academy's musicals. He was also a guitar player and somebody who absolutely loved to travel. It's really clear that Gordy was such a talented young man, and he would have done so many incredible things with his life had it not been cut short in a senseless hazing incident. After high school, Gordy decided that he would be attending the University of Colorado Boulder, where he decided to pledge for the Chi Psi fraternity, and he also joined the club lacrosse team on campus, which I think just really shows he really wanted to be involved in his new community on campus and just make new friends being so many states away from home. On September 16th of 2004, just weeks into the fall semester, the Chi Psi fraternity was holding their bid day. Bid day is essentially where all of the pledges were going to find out if they had been selected to become full members of the fraternity or not. Most Greek life organizations are, as we talked about earlier, very dedicated to their traditions, and they usually do have a tradition for the new members on bid day. Unfortunately, for the new members of Chi Psi, with Gordy included, this fraternity had a particularly grueling and really cruel tradition. Gordy and 26 other new pledges were blindfolded and taken into the Arapaho Roosevelt National Forest, still dressed in their coats and ties from earlier in the day. They all sat around a bonfire and were told that they needed to finish 4 handles of whiskey and 6 bottles of wine between them in the next 30 minutes. Now, the fraternity will obviously deny that this was said, but it has been reported by witnesses that they were all told they could not leave until all of the alcohol was gone. Once all of the bottles of alcohol had been finished, the pledges were taken back to the fraternity house for a party where they continued drinking. Now, this next statement is going to be alleged, but the accounts of what was going on during this party are really fuzzy, and I would venture to guess that it's because the fraternity brothers didn't want to get in trouble for being present on this night. But to be fair, it could also just be because everyone was so intoxicated that they didn't really pay attention until it became abundantly clear that something was wrong. Whatever the reason might be for the spotty accounts of what happened on that night, we do know that around 11 o'clock p.m., Gordy, being very visibly intoxicated, was put onto a couch to sleep it off. His now brothers, heavy on the quotation marks there, proceeded to draw on his face and body with permanent markers, which is something that Chi Psi members were encouraged to do as part of a ritual to embarrass the brothers who had passed out from drinking too much. Now, I do want to say, I just think it's really sad, and obviously there's a failure within the education system somewhere where people don't realize how dangerous it actually is when somebody passes out like this, especially after the hazing that Gordy had gone through. For people to not immediately know that that was a red flag and that something was seriously dangerous and he needed an ambulance is really concerning. And if you're listening to this episode now, just know that if you ever see anything like that, call 911 right away, because if somebody had, it legitimately could have saved Gordy's life. In Gordy's case, it wasn't until 10 hours later, I'm going to say that again, 10 hours later, that one of Gordy's fraternity brothers, who identified himself as Cal, finally called a 911 dispatcher saying that Gordy was unresponsive and that it didn't look like he was breathing. I am going to play a little bit of the 911 call here just so that you can get some context as to what was happening at that time.
Is he breathing?
I don't know. He's not waking up.
How do you know he was drinking?
I got back last night and a bunch of them were all drinking.
Is he blue or cold?
No, he's not very cold. He doesn't look blue.
So you can't tell if he's breathing or not?
It doesn't look like it.
You don't think what? It doesn't look like what?
It doesn't look like he's breathing very much at all.
At all, or not very much?
Doesn't look like it at all.
Do you see his chest rising?
Well, he's lying on his chest.
Okay, can you turn him over on his back?
Hang on. He's a big guy.
Like how big?
230 pounds.
Okay.
I don't know if I can roll him over.
Now, as you probably heard in the 911 call, Gordy was found lying on his chest, which means he was face down on the floor, so you did hear the dispatcher asking this person to turn him over. By the time first responders got to the fraternity house, it was clear that absolutely nothing could be done at that point for Gordy, and his parents received the phone call that morning, September 17th. This is just the most unimaginable thing to go through, not only as a parent, but just as a loved one in general in this situation. I can't imagine how helpless, confused, and just devastated they must have been. Gordy Bailey was only 18 years old, and the people who were supposed to be looking out for him had left him lying on the floor for 10 hours. His blood alcohol level was a shocking 0.328, so his cause of death was determined to be alcohol overdose. Unfortunately, the common theme in cases where hazing has directly led to the death of a college student, there don't tend to be extreme consequences to the fraternity themselves, and CU Boulder did what they could, but it honestly wasn't much. And I would ask you to remember at this point that the schools don't really have a lot of autonomy over what happens in sororities and fraternities. Chi Psi was ousted from the campus, and CU Boulder asked sororities and fraternities to implement 2 new rules. One that would delay member recruitment for the spring semester, and allowing in-house directors to be present at all sororities and fraternities. These ideas were accepted by the sororities on campus, but not by the fraternities. They decided instead to establish the Undergraduate Interfraternity Council at the University of Colorado Incorporated, which was again not affiliated with the university itself. This is a nonprofit organization run by CU Boulder fraternity members that has its own judicial board. The judicial board will hear cases and issue punishments for any issues related to hazing, alcohol use, and sexual assault. The organization is very closed and they don't release details of the judicial board activities. Since it has started in 2005, the Interfraternity Council has expelled 3 fraternities for violations related to hazing and alcohol use. Delta Chi was expelled in 2008 after an alcohol-related hazing incident caused damage to a local motel. Sigma Pi was expelled in 2013, and Kappa Sigma was expelled in 2015 after violations related to sexual assault. Kappa Sigma was on very thin ice when they were expelled, and their expulsion in 2015 came after it was alleged that a group of members showed up at the home of the president of the Interfraternity Council and demanded that he come outside and fight them, which shows a clearly concerning mindset and pattern of behavior among Greek life participants. Pretty much they're constantly behaving as if they are above authority and above punishment. The fraternities that are associated with the Interfraternity Council are not associated with the university and remain independent, which does cause a strange dynamic on campus where students essentially need to choose between the university and the fraternity. The university did invite these unrecognized fraternities, of which there are nearly 20, to join the university, but they refused, being, quote, fiercely protective of their independence. Chi Psi itself returned to campus in 2011, and the very same year, Playboy named CU Boulder the nation's top party school for its easy access to alcohol and marijuana. Now, I'm mentioning this because I think it's really important to know that very little change actually comes out of a tragic hazing death, and popular media like Playboy is continuing to glamorize partying and Greek life in college, which makes it even more essential that everyone realize these can be genuinely dangerous organizations, and students need to know what they might be exposed to. And if you're hearing any weird noises at this point in the podcast, just know that my dog is behind me licking his lips, so sorry about that. The temporary ban of Chi Psi from CU Boulder after Gordy Bailey's death is a pretty common punishment for hazing, and Gordy's parents had their own thoughts on the school's reaction, which Michael Lanahan, who was Gordy's stepfather, expressed. He said, quote, "It seemed that this was viewed as an acceptable collateral damage in their business. Everybody was trying to circle the wagons, and nobody really seemed to care about Gordy or Gordy's family or what they had done," end quote. After Gordy's death, the Lanahan family was given a monetary settlement, which was significantly reduced by a Colorado law that caps non-economic damages, and at least 10 members of Chi Psi pled guilty to charges of providing alcohol to a minor. The family directed their entire settlement towards creating the Gordy Foundation, which has now joined with the University of Virginia to create the Gordy Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. This center provides educational materials, especially regarding the symptoms of alcohol poisoning, and talks about encouraging bystanders to call 911 if they believe someone is in danger. They also hold a National Gordy Day every September during National Hazing and Prevention Week. Obviously, the story of Gordy Bailey is incredibly tragic and so disturbing, and I wish that I could say it was the only story that I could find, but unfortunately there are so many more that are hauntingly similar. The next case that I want to talk about today is the case of Michael Deng. Michael Deng was born as an Asian American in Queens in 1995. Out of respect for Michael and his family, I'm just going to refer to him as Michael. Honestly, I have no idea how to pronounce his cultural name, so I'm not even going to try. As a child, his dad was traveling back and forth between the US and China for work, so he spent a lot of time with his mother, who actually left her own job and spent countless hours studying the subjects that Michael was learning in school, just so that she could help him be more successful. Her efforts, while I commend them so much, were actually hugely successful, and in 8th grade, he took the specialized high school admissions test, actually doing well enough to be placed at Bronx Science for high school, which was one of New York's top tier of selective public schools. The students at this school were primarily Asian American, and it's where Michael got to meet one of his best friends named William Yon. With his high school friends, Michael would go to boba shops, play Pokemon, League of Legends, play handball, and really just hang out like normal friend group things for high school students. As high school was coming to a close, Michael was deciding between two schools, Stony Brook University, where his friend William was going, and Baruch College, a commuter school that was close to his mother. Understandably, because of how close they were, Michael didn't want to be far away from his mother, so he ended up choosing Baruch College, but he still really wanted that college experience, so he did decide to move into the student dorms with his new roommate named Jay Chen. After Michael's death, Jay Chen wrote him a letter containing the following quote, I remember on my birthday freshman year you brought home a 6-pack of Corona for us to celebrate. I never questioned how you got your hands on it, but I was just glad you did. Of course, being the type of people we were, we didn't have bottle openers. Obviously, the most important thing to do at that moment was to figure out ways to open a bottle without a bottle opener. Thanks to you, I now know about 900 different ways to open a bottle without a bottle opener. I chose to share this story with you because it is just so unequivocally normal. I feel like everyone has stories like this with their high school and college friends, but here the difference is that Michael's friends have to look back on their fondest memories with him, knowing that he's not here anymore, to laugh about these moments with, and that's just so beyond heartbreaking. At Baruch College, Greek life was a huge part of the social life of students, and freshmen were always encouraged to take part. Michael's roommate decided that it wasn't for him, but Michael himself decided to rush Pi Delta Psi. Jay Chen would speak about Michael's general demeanor during the rush process, saying, quote, "Michael would come home and tell me about all the people he had met. He seemed enthusiastic at first. But as pledging continued, he seemed to get more and more tired, and he became less of his normal self. We spoke less. Every time he came home, he was absolutely exhausted and usually fell straight to sleep," end quote. Pi Delta Psi was originally founded in 1994 by a group of 11 students at Binghamton University, and it was supposed to be a group that was dedicated to supporting Asian American students. Alumni are familiar with a common refrain among fraternity members: kinship through a common history of suffering and consciousness through education. However, in more ways than one, Pi Delta Psi was a typical university fraternity, and former pledges describe some of the hazing that they were subjected to, including a hell week where they were deprived of sleep and made to carry backpacks filled with bricks or bowling balls. One of the most well-known rituals among Pi Delta Psi fraternity members is the initiation ritual called the glass ceiling. The day before he was supposed to break the glass ceiling was December 7th of 2013. Michael drove from the city to a house in Tunkhannock Township, I think. It's a tiny town in the Poconos. But he didn't tell his family or girlfriend of this trip before he left. It was sometime after midnight, so this would be December 8th, that the glass ceiling ritual started. I should mention at this point that this ritual is also known as the gauntlet, so that should pretty much tell you everything that you need to know about it. First, the pledge is blindfolded and separated from his big. He will then find his way back to his big while the other members verbally abuse him with racial slurs and other insults. So that, like I mentioned, is the first stage of this ritual. The second 2 stages are essentially physical assaults on the pledges from other members of the fraternity. They are pushed, knocked down, and tackled until the pledge educator determines that they have had enough. While the national fraternity will not admit that this type of hazing takes place, alumni say that it is deeply ingrained in the fraternity and it's a tradition in pretty much every chapter. Michael was the last of his pledge class to go through the ritual, and he made it through a lot until one final tackle in the last stage left him a little unsteady on his feet. He was unable to stand up on his own, and he was really starting to slur his speech. After this became pretty apparent that there was something wrong, it was then that pledge assistant Kenny Kwan ran full speed at Michael and slammed him to the ground. After this, Michael did not get up. Pledge educator Sheldon Wan, who was 21, picked Michael up with the help of others and brought him inside. Another member of the frat named Charles Lay said that his body felt straight like a board. The frat members laid him by the fireplace and covered him with a blanket to keep him warm. Remember, this is December. At 5:05 a.m., one of the frat brothers called his girlfriend, who was a nurse, and asked her why Michael was still unresponsive. At 5:13 a.m., another member of the fraternity Googles the words conscious and unconscious. At 5:55 a.m., frat brother Revel Dang texted a friend 4 separate times to ask this friend about his own grandfather who had taken a fatal fall down the stairs. And as all of this was happening, not one person called an ambulance. And just to make that even worse, if it could be, there were over 30 people in this house, and no one did anything. They wouldn't seek help until Sheldon Wong and Charles Lay, along with someone else from the frat, drove Michael to Gazinger, Wyoming Valley Hospital. Again, I think that's how it's pronounced. I really don't know. At 6:42 a.m., Michael's mother would receive a harrowing phone call from the hospital. Michael was in a coma. Michael died the next day, December 9th, with his mother by his side, and a pathologist would determine his cause of death to be multiple traumatic head injuries. The pathologist also said that the delay in treatment had significantly contributed to Michael's death. The case of Michael's death would go to court in New York, and prosecutor Kimberly Metzger would say, Dang did not have any sort of alcohol in his system, and the 3 young men who brought him did not seem to be under the influence. However, these men were not providing the level of detail that one would expect you to have if your friend had suffered such a traumatic injury, which I think is a really telling quote here. It was only after questioning that any of these boys would admit that they were even part of the same fraternity at all. The following quote from an article written about Michael's death will tell you pretty much all you need to know about this tragedy. Quote, when individuals get seriously injured in hazing incidents, police face a wall of silence. Individuals are committed to their brotherhood, end quote. In the end, 37 defendants were charged, mostly charges like aggravated assault and hazing, but many for hindering apprehension, which would essentially mean that they weren't cooperating with the police investigation. 4 members of the frat did plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter: Charles Lay, Kenny Kwan, Raymond Lamb, and Sheldon Wong. Kenny Kwan was sentenced to 12 to 24 months, Sheldon Wong and Raymond Lamb were sentenced to 10 to 24 months, and Charles Lay was released on time served after 342 days. The fraternity itself was convicted for involuntary manslaughter and aggravated assault, but was acquitted of the more serious charges of third-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. It was banned from Pennsylvania for 10 years and ordered to pay a fine of $110,000, but the ban was overturned on appeal. On the needlessly tragic death of a student, Baruch College said, quote, Dang died needlessly as a result of a hazing ritual that occurred during an unsanctioned, secret, off-campus pledging event that violated college policies. Sadly, deaths and injuries as a result of hazing remains a national problem, and the ramifications are frequently devastating, end quote. Now, for most of us, when we think of hazing, we think of like a drinking game gone too far, and most of the time we're also thinking about fraternities. However, I want to tell you another story that doesn't involve either of those things, because hazing can happen anywhere to anyone, and each person's experience with it can be vastly different. This story is pretty horrifying, but it's extremely important to tell, so let's talk about what happened at Illinois State University. In May of 2022, the Lambda Epsilon chapter of the sorority Zeta Pi Beta was suspended after many members came forward to report their hazing experiences with the sorority, and many of them even dropping it altogether. The students reported a number of disturbing accounts of hazing, and one former student even described what she had been through as brainwashing. Lambda Epsilon had an extreme initiation process that included a restricted diet of bread and water, physical abuse, and a cult-like atmosphere. Emails sent to WGLT from the NPR network described pledges being beaten, pushed, slapped, scratched, and paddled. A complaint sent to Zeta Phi Beta headquarters detailed a senior member throwing wet cotton balls at pledges, calling people fat and ugly, and screaming verbal abuse at them for hours. This hazing was part of a disturbing pattern at this chapter, and a former pledge from 2018 named Leslie Mason had described her experience, saying, quote, "We really didn't have a life. We had to live together. I felt like a slave because of all the stuff that we had to do. Mind you, it's only 6 of us, and it's a lot of them. And we weren't just dealing with the women in the sorority on campus already. We were dealing with women that were in a sorority as well, but older." She went on to say, "I felt really depressed. I know we all felt drained. Looking back at it, I always had a lingering question in the back of my head, like, Leslie, why are you doing this?" Students also described bringing their concerns to Zeta Phi Beta on a national level. These concerns were pretty much entirely ignored, and the headquarters has not responded to requests from media outlets for comment. And after all of this, do you want to take a guess how long the sorority was suspended for? 12 months. 1 year. That's all. To round out the episode, I want to share some stories that were written by people who have experienced hazing, just so that you can hear them talk about it firsthand in their own words, so it's not just me. The first one was posted to the Hazing Stories subreddit only about 3 weeks ago, and it's titled, "Do not pledge during freshman year unless you've done your complete research. Know what you are getting into." I have recently joined a fraternity this year. Now, I do not regret my decision. My brothers are very dear to my heart. However, that doesn't excuse the process for me to be where I am. It was months of late nights being paddled, doing embarrassing exercises, and saying embarrassing and personal things just to not get beat. I wouldn't be back in my dorm until 2 or 3 in the morning. Mind you, I had classes at 8 and 9. Suffice it to say that I skipped a lot of my classes because I was just too tired to get up and go to them. And for that, I almost failed out of my spring semester. My mental health was in the gutter. My morale was lower than hell, especially after our hell night. A night of again getting paddled, eating gross foods, and nearly getting beat up just for doing what we were told. And what was the reward? A giant welt on my ass to the point where I couldn't even sit without feeling pain. So understand this. Please do your research. Believe the stories on reports and hazing. These groups do haze. They have just gotten better at hiding it. And when you do your research and you still feel like you want to do it, by all means, good luck. Stay safe and bail out if it becomes too much. Do not become another statistic. This next story is from Quora, and it was posted about 11 months ago by someone who graduated from Binghamton University in 2014. I was once in a fraternity that had some of the worst hazing I'd ever even heard of. This is all very real and wasn't very long ago, so I know that this still happens. In the middle of the night, new pledges would be ripped from bed, stripped naked, blindfolded, and put into a large coffin in the basement of the fraternity house for several hours. While in the coffin, pledges would periodically be forced to answer questions about the fraternity's history. For every question you answered wrong, you spent another hour in the coffin, alone, in the dark, and cold. When you are finally let out of the coffin, you are still blindfolded and naked. You think you are in the clear, but they are waiting for you with bags of flour and hot dogs. I'll let your imagination work as to what they did with the combination. Every pledge had to go through this at least once. The other forms of hazing that were used on any given night included having to clean before or after parties, doing all of the errands that go with a party, being forced to drink as much as possible, and the most disturbing thing by far was being forced to play Limp Bizkit. If you don't know, look it up. I'm interjecting here. I don't know what that is. Please don't look it up. I don't want to know, and I don't think anybody else does either. There is so much more that I can't even think of, let alone explain. Just know that this stuff still happens, and all of these other posts describing frats and sororities as safe and hazing being a thing of the past are false. Hearing it directly from someone who has experienced hazing firsthand really helped me to put this whole issue into perspective, because luckily it's not something that I've ever experienced. My lack of experience with hazing, however, is exactly why I felt it was important to put this episode out as we get near to the beginning of the school year. Especially as a high school student, hazing was pretty much the last thing on my mind as I was heading into college, because it just wasn't something that anyone had talked about or even warned me about. To me, this makes all of the stories that we've talked about today even more devastating, because most people genuinely join Greek life with good intentions, not knowing what horrific things they are going to have to endure. I understand that it's easy to make the argument that these students could just leave their pledge class and not be a part of the organization, but for a young person who is on their own for the first time, that's actually a really difficult thing to do. Going into college, you really just want to fit in, and you're in an entirely new environment that can feel really overwhelming. This, coupled with the fact that college students generally don't have a lot of life experience to have learned from, and the basic need for belonging is so intense at a young age, it's really not hard to see why students won't often take the steps to protect themselves from hazing behaviors. And like I said, that's exactly why we're having this conversation, because more people need to be talking about the dangers of hazing on college campuses and even in high schools across the U.S. If young students know that hazing is not an anomaly, but it can be the standard of behavior in some organizations, Then they'll be able to make more informed decisions about whether they want to participate. That being said, I'd like to go ahead and end off this episode by providing some of that information to you. And if you know someone who is in high school or college, share some of this information with them because, as we've seen today, it can literally be life-saving. So first, let's just share some basic statistics on hazing to give context to this conversation. Every year, about 1.5 million high school students experience hazing, and nearly half of college students have already experienced hazing before starting college. Alcohol poisoning is the most common cause of death when it comes to hazing. In 95% of hazing cases, students aware that they had been the victim of hazing did not report it. Around 55% of college students who are involved in clubs, teams, and organizations experience hazing. Keep that in mind because it's literally more often than not that this is happening, and really, please don't forget that. And the most disturbing statistic, in my opinion, is that an estimated 25% of students have reported experiencing hazing before the age of 13. The Gordy Bailey Center has provided some educational resources about how to recognize when someone might be experiencing alcohol poisoning and how you can help. If you think someone may need medical attention, use the PUBS acronym. P stands for puking while passed out. U stands for unresponsive to pinching or shaking. B stands for breathing is noisy, slow, shallow, or has stopped. And S refers to skin is blue, cold, or clammy. If you see even one PUBS sign, call 911 immediately. And for anyone who might be underage, please remember that while it's normal to be afraid of getting in trouble, the long-term consequences can be really, really dangerous, and I promise you don't want to live with the guilt of not seeking help for somebody who needed it. Okay, so I know that this episode was definitely a little bit of a downer, but that's okay because this is a true crime podcast after all. Still though, in all seriousness, I do think this is a really important thing for people to be aware of and to be talking about, and I'm not usually someone who prefers raising awareness over genuinely enacting change. But when it comes to hazing, we actually do need to raise awareness. Greek life can be very closed circle, and it's pretty much the closest thing to a secret society that you'll see integrated into the culture of young people. So the more people are aware of the dangers it can bring, the better they'll be able to make decisions that will keep themselves and the people around them safe. But again, it's a real bummer, so don't worry. Next Monday's episode is still going to be true crime, but not the deadly kind, so at least we have that to look forward to, hopefully. And now, all of that being said, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Crime Bistro podcast. If you've made it this far, just know how much I genuinely appreciate it because I put a lot of thought into this episode. If you'd like to follow along with the podcast during the week, I tell a lot of fun, crazy, and true crime stories on TikTok, which is the easiest place to interact. But you can also just go ahead and join the Instagram or visit the Crime Bistro website. Again, this is a huge thank you to anybody who made it this far into the episode, and we've got a lot of exciting stuff upcoming on this podcast, so make sure that you stay tuned. With that, this episode is coming to a close, so it was so great to have you here, and we'll end, as always, until next time.